Mad, unseelie fae have crossed the veil of twilight into the fields we know. The Sidhe are restless in their fairy mounds. The Parliament of Eng grows disquieted. It's time, come with me, to face down the Queen of Elfland's son. Hey everyone, I'm Garrett, and today we're going to talk about another DCC module. I love these DCC modules. The Queen of Elfland's Son by Michael Curtis. I've talked about Michael Curtis before. I think he's a brilliant author. I looked at his The Croaking Fane. You can see that here. And we're going to talk about the Queen of Elfland's Son today. So it's 20 pages. It's published for DCC. It's for first level characters. Now, in DCC, characters don't attain very many levels, and actually the lethality is really high. So first level is not the same as the lowest level adventure for DCC, because DCC has level 0 adventures called funnels. I've talked about those before, the Sailors on the Silent Sea. You can see that here. So it's a first level adventure. It's not meant to be the first adventure, but it is meant to be a kind of beginner's adventure. Maybe the first thing that characters do after the funnel adventure. It's an open homage to Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter, that kind of seminally important fantasy novel that Dunsany wrote in the 1920s that informs so much of our fantasy today. And actually, unlike something like Lord of the Rings, we don't appreciate, but actually, it's one of my favorite novels. I've talked about the books I think are important before, but you should absolutely go and look at and have a read and grapple with The King of Elfland's Daughter if you want to understand where fantasy has come from. Also, the other thing about this is that it's been promised a sequel. It is really good. I only talk about things that I really like on this channel. It is really good. There is a promised sequel of it, but at the time of recording, that sequel hasn't turned up yet. I'm really looking forward to it. It's left with a complete yet open ending, this module. It's 20 pages, like all DCC modules, and as ever, the prose is brilliant. And you know, all that simple stuff like the artwork is fantastic. The map is wonderful. It's all Doug Kovacs, as usual, the usual kind of like house artist for DCC. So my bona fides before we get going. I have run it twice before. I have run it once for Old School Essentials by Gavin Norman, and that was for 6th level adventurers. Oh no, wait, actually I've run it, yeah, I've run it once for Old School Essentials, for yeah, 5th, 6th level adventures, and I've run it once at my system, Journeyman Expert Master, once. And that was for 3rd level adventurers, and both times the players, it was a different group both times, and they had a blast. And it was part of a kind of sandbox campaign, you know, very modular campaign where players kind of just mess around and kind of play with different things and see what turns up. So let's talk about the through line. What is the kind of overall adventure going on here? What is going on in the Parliament of Eng and in and around Elfland? So the party meet with the Parliament of Eng. This is a really obvious kind of reference to the Parliament of Earl, which turns up in the novel. And the elders of the village of Eng are kind of members of the Parliament, and they are aware that there's been numerous strange sightings and attacks within the last 6 nights in and around the village of Eng, especially near this farmer's farm, Marrow's farm. So what they do is, the hook is really straightforward. They ask the party to go and investigate and see what's going on. So the party travel to Marrow's farm, where they meet an old farmer, and he's really kind of cautious. He's a little bit frightened. I always play him up as kind of Black Country. I think that's just like really, really, really good fun. And that's exactly the kind of atmosphere I think that Dunsany is trying to evoke when he wrote The King of Elfland's Daughter. And what happens is he will agree to help them if they agree to kind of basically stop the attacks on his livestock. And he's kind of got a group of goats. And what is going on is that an unseelie unicorn, a kind of evil unicorn, is passing from the Vale of Twilight, passing from Elfland and attacking his farm, and they have to face down this unicorn, and it is wonderful, right? It is really good fun to have them fighting this kind of like black evil unicorn. When I talked about The House on the Island by Errol Otis, which is another DCC module, I talked about some double spread page art where you could see this like really horrible monster. That was by Doug Kovacs, and there is this absolute, the same thing is going on here. There's a wonderful 2-page page art of them fighting the unseelie unicorn, which is just fantastic. It's just, that was the thing that when I picked this module up at a convention, I was like, I want this module. This is a thing that I want going on, because it's so kind of strangely Celtic and fairish and frightening, and it reminds me of like Sapkowski's The Witcher. I just think it's great. So they fight this unicorn, they drive it off, or they kill it. And then what happens is Marrow, then the farmer Marrow tells them that and there's a nearby fairy fort, a kind of fairy mound, a sort of barrow that has become active at twilight. Sorry, that has become active, and the kind of fairies, the elves are coming from this place. That's where the unicorns come from, and they're going to have to go in. Now it's only accessible. The gateway on this mound into it only appears at twilight, and I love the sense of liminality going on in this module. This kind of like between day and night. It only appears at twilight. It only appears at gloaming. So they go to this fairy mound, which, by the way, gloaming is also kind of like surrounded by a lake. Oh, it's great. There's a really fantastic novel by Poul Anderson called I forget what it's called. It gives us the idea of law versus chaos in D&D. It's fantastic. Three Hearts and Three Lines, that's it. And in that, there's a fairy mound, which works very, very similar. This kind of like liminality, this idea of crossing thresholds, night and day, granting accessibility. It's just fantastic. So the party goes to the fairy mound, and at the fairy mound, they enter it, and this is the dungeon. This is the kind of meat of the module. So having done all that, we're actually kind of getting to the entrance of it. So they enter the dungeon. It's really interesting, and the party get to engage in not just in combat, but in trickery and exploration to try and find the Prince Ashheart, who is the prince in charge of the eponymous Queen of Elfland's son, who is the elf responsible for starting this vanguard invasion of the material plane. And there's some really cool stuff going on in this fairy mound that we'll talk about in a minute. So the party make their way through the fairy mound, and then they confront Prince Ashheart right in the center, and the combat ensues. And that is the through line. So let's talk about what I liked. I only review things that I like. I run loads of stuff, but I only really talk about stuff that I like because I think that it's so hard for us as game masters to sift through the stuff that is terrible, okay, and the stuff that's really good. And this is really, really, really good. I'm a professed lover of Lord Dunsany. I love The King of Elfland's Daughter, and this captures, not entirely, but it captures some of that tone. I don't know if any of you have played The Chained Coffin by Goodman Games, which kind of just about captures the kind of like Appalachian, I don't know how you pronounce it, Appalachian folklore. And it's mostly successful in doing that. Well, this is mostly successful in capturing Lord Dunsany's tone in The King of Elfland's Daughter and translating that into a really fun fantasy adventure. The theme is really strong. I think this is something that DCC do really well. You can see it in the Croaking Fane. You can see it in the Music of the Spheres is Chaos. You can see strong tone is something that they do really, really well. And actually, this captures some of that strange Celtic she fairy folkloric kind of creepiness, while also not being grimdark like something like The Witcher, actually still maintaining a little bit of kind of whimsy. There's some really good beats to this adventure. That's probably one of the reasons I would recommend you having a look at this. It comes together really nicely and really naturally. None of it seems forced. You don't find yourself scrabbling around for a hook and trying to get the players involved at any moment. It kind of like naturally glides from one event to the next. At least the two times I've run it, that's what's happened. The going to the farm is a welcome into the adventure. The fairy mound is varied with some kind of cool fairy tale like encounters, which remind me of on some level it reminds me of Winter's Daughter by Gavin Norman for OSC. I reviewed that here. There is some really strange, I think Celtic Gaelic kind of creatures. The Booker in the larder. Oh yeah, Booker. Yeah, I mean, stuff from Welsh folklore, really, really cool. It's absolutely wonderful. And there is something very Welsh about this. Again, about this idea of liminality, space between spaces and thresholds, right? The mound is only accessible at night. It's very kind of like Welsh, which is kind of like, I think there's a sense of kind of passing over as someone who's English. When you go to Wales, you've not really left the country, but you kind of have left the country. You've not left Britain. There is mound trolls here and furbolg. Yeah, all these Gaelic kind of Celtic creatures. And there's an enslaved dwarf who can work iron. And he's in the forge. He can work iron, unlike the elves, which I just think is great. That maintaining that idea that iron is something dangerous. Cold iron is dangerous to elves. Which I just think is really interesting and appeals to a particular type of elvish fantasy that we don't usually get. And then the final encounter with Prince Ashat is just wonderful. There's a really, really, really good piece of artwork in the front of the book. It's not really a handout, but I think that is the case often with DCC. There's really good art. There's no handouts, but you should just show it to the players anyway. And I just love the idea of these elves. I always describe them as having bone-like skin to separate them from kind of like lesser sort of elves of your world that have kind of, dominated by spending so much time on the material plane. These are truer elves that are kind of like long of limb and pale of skin, and but not just pale, but like white of skin. And it makes them kind of seem a little bit more otherworldly compared to, I imagine, the elves that naturally inhabit your world. So what did I change? Or what concerns would a game master have running the King of Elfland's daughter? Sorry, the Queen of Elfland's son. Very little. I just buy it. I buy it and run it. It's going to take you 1 to 3 sessions, I think, to get through it. It's not very long, but that's exactly how a modular adventure should feel. There's an implied second part of the module. I mentioned earlier that I read somewhere that we've kind of promised a sequel to this. There's a gateway to Elfland at the center of the fairy mound that's guarded by Hearn the Hunter, who's a kind of fawn-like, godlike scion. Who is a reference to Orion in The King of Elfland's Daughter. I would cut that whole portal, that whole moment, if you don't intend to use a sequel, or if you want to run it and you don't want, you're not comfortable with characters stepping over into Elfland. I actually used this as the first adventure stepping into Elfland to run 5e's The Wild Beyond the Witchlight. So this was that, that kind of portal that's there makes sense to me. I used The Queen of Elfland's Son, Winter's Daughter by Gavin Norman, both as setups for then going and doing that 5e adventure, which I ran with Jem, which I'll maybe talk about at a different time. But if you don't want to go into Elfland, get rid of that portal. I would emphasize the liminality of the place. It's only accessible at twilight. It's, which is a time which is also difficult to access because a lake appears around it. Inside the mound is presented as like a forest. There's lots of rooms where they're evidently underground, but there's like trees growing like they're in the center of a wood. The invasion from Elfland feels like a pull to a distant plane. I would emphasize all those thematics and the kind of strangeness, the inhuman quality of these elves. These are not just humans with pointy ears. They are a different species with different motives and different ideas. And I think that works really, really, really well for this module. I absolutely love this module. And I think that, if you haven't run it, you should definitely run it. If you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. As ever, thank you for taking the time to listen. I'll put a link to that below. I'll put a link to the free version of my game, Journeyman Expert Master, below. Like and subscribe, all that good stuff. And as ever, I'm Gary. Many thanks for listening, and I will speak with you again soon.